Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today's presentation is featuring a friend and colleague who lives in Canada. His name is Ken Eakin. Ken has recently written and published a book, and I always admire people that take the time to take the current thinking and devote the time to do the hard work of writing a book, and I'm pleased that Ken has agreed to share some of his thoughts that is in the book, and also share some of his wisdom and knowledge on the topic of what he's calling office lean. So a little bit of housekeeping here, as we usually do. I will have the phones muted as we begin the conversation. And there's a time toward the end that we're going to unmute for Q&A. You can always use the chat function that's available on the computer screen, and you can ask questions that way. And when we do unmute the phones later, I'll just make sure that we don't have any background noise that people don't want to unintentionally share. And we'll have a conversation at the end after Ken is finished with his presentation. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to Ken. I met Ken a couple years ago as we were doing work with the company that he works with in Canada. And again, he's taken the time to put this together. So I'm going to allow Ken to do his own introduction and get us oriented to the topics that he's going to discuss today. So Ken, you have the comm. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. As you can read on the screen, the title of this talk or webinar is Office Lean. And then it has this big, long, kind of complicated subtitle, which I have to admit was my publisher's choice, not my choice. But it is appropriate, understanding and implementing flow in a professional and administrative environment. So a bit of a mouthful, but it does quite explain what I was trying to do in the book. And just before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about how this book came about. Like, why did I write this? And there were kind of two main factors. One was that I found that a lot of lean literature and consultants and experts and gurus and so on, and all the content and media around lean, 90% of it to me was all about manufacturing, and maybe another 8 or 9% was about healthcare, and then there was sort of 1% in the other category that was about offices. And well, it's a bit of an academic debate, I suppose, whether there's just one lean. What I found is that people really in the office, they didn't really relate very well to stories of widgets being made or cars being made and, a lot of raw materials and stamping steel and all of that. They didn't get it. I mean, I work in a financial institution where we just have digital inventory and money, and things just whiz around electronically. And so no one got it. There was no factory. So that was a barrier that I wanted to overcome, because I really believe that lean is a wonderful, wonderful philosophy, but it wasn't really sinking in with people who work in a so-called white-collar environment. And then the other aspect of it was that they were understanding some of the tools and concepts quite straightforwardly. It was kind of common sense, but then there were some things that were very counterintuitive, and one of those was flow, this notion of working on one thing at a time. And so I really wanted to focus on that aspect of lean. So I'll take you through the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of flow, which will be familiar to people who have been practicing lean for a while. But I'll talk about how I kind of simplified and conceptualized it for an office crowd. And so it might be useful to you if you're trying to communicate to others who don't work in a manufacturing environment. And yeah, so that's what I'll do. I'll talk a little bit about the concept, and then I'll talk about some real examples of how we put it into practice at my place of work. So just a quick introduction about me. That's a little picture of me. In real life, I'm much better looking and younger, but that's me. Yeah, Mike's laughing now. EDC, Export Development Canada. So as Mike mentioned, I'm working in Ottawa, Ontario, the capital of Canada. You know, it's got a climate similar to that of Minnesota for those of you who are in that area. So not this time of year, not the most wonderful place to be, but EDC is a wonderful place. We support Canadian exporters with financial products and solutions. We're wholly owned by the government of Canada, but we operate at an arm's length. So we really operate on commercial principles. We charge interest on loans. We charge premiums on insurance products, and we are financially self-sustaining. So we do report to government, but we operate as a commercial entity. So it's kind of an interesting hybrid between private and public sector. And I've been working there for about 6 years as a senior advisor of operational excellence. And prior to that, I worked with a gigantic shipping line called Maersk Line. If any of you have lived anywhere near a port, you'll be very familiar with Maersk Line. I worked in their Toronto office, which wasn't close to the ocean at all, but again, in an office in the customer service and operations area. So that's been my professional career. So let me jump in a little bit here. I mentioned earlier that I, was finding it hard to explain some of the core concepts of lean to people who worked in an office and didn't have physical inventory to manage. And I kept asking them this one question, which was, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word lean? And I asked this of students, because I teach a course at the University of Ottawa. I asked this of professionals. I asked this of leaders. I asked this of frontline associates. And I heard all sorts of maybe predictable answers like, oh, that's a Japanese manufacturing thing. Or if they knew a little bit more about it, they'd say, it's all about waste. It's all about waste, or it's about value, or it's about developing people. But I heard most of all, the word I heard over and over and over again was efficiency. Oh, that's about efficiency. It's about efficiency. It's about efficiency. So then, of course, it begs the question, well, what do we mean by efficiency? And when they go on to explain that, most people, when you ask them what they mean by efficiency, they think, well, it's doing more things in less time. It's doing stuff faster. It's being more productive. Making more widgets in less time. And I didn't really like that answer very much, because I thought that lean was all about, respecting people and continuously improving and flowing value to customers and having customer focus and making work better for people. And it really wasn't about making people work harder and faster, but people had this notion that it was all about making people work harder and faster. So I kind of went on a mission to disabuse people of this common notion of efficiency. And while I was doing that, I discovered this beautiful little book, which is now my second favorite book on lean. And it's written by two Swedish guys, and it's a great little book. I highly recommend it. And I borrow from it quite a lot in my own book. And they define efficiency in two ways. I thought this is a really interesting concept. So they talk about one type of efficiency as resource efficiency, and another type of efficiency as flow efficiency. So I'll explain a little bit what they mean by this, because it aligns very much with what I was trying to communicate and what I am trying to communicate. So resource efficiency is our conventional notion of efficiency. it's really about utilization. It's about cranking out widgets per hour. And I've got a little picture of a factory there because it's a real industrial kind of notion. It comes from the age of the Industrial Revolution, and which has been with us for 250 years, maybe if you're from England. It's this notion that if you are a capitalist, if you own the means of production, then you would go out and buy yourself a factory and a bunch of expensive machines and equipment, and then you'd hire a bunch of labor. And the way you would make a profitable business is by keeping everything highly utilized. Keep that factory utilized, keep your machines running all the time, keep your people working hard with the assumption that they're naturally lazy and don't want to do work, right? And so it becomes this rather simplistic equation. And yeah, I'm being reductive, but generally this is the mindset that if you keep your people and your machines constantly busy, you will be successful. And utilization isn't altogether bad, but there's a lot of problems that overemphasis on utilization creates. And I think they apply to all industries, but I certainly notice them in an office environment. And if you work in an office environment, I think you'll recognize some of these as well. One is handoffs, this notion of kind of a division of labor, and then these functional silos that are built up, and the confusion that results with handoffs, too many handoffs, which results in a lot of complexity because you don't know where the work is or who the work belongs with or who owns it and when they're going to complete it and so on and so forth. And with the complexity of our modern enterprises, we get delays. Things go into the system and they never come out. So people are exceptionally busy, as in they're resource efficient, right? Or they're being kept busy by their managers, if not by their own sort of work ethic. And they're very, very busy. Everybody is incredibly busy in an office. If you doubt this, next time you step into an elevator, ask your colleagues, oh, how's it going? I bet they'll answer, I'm busy, oh yeah, how are things? Busy, busy, busy. Everyone's busy all the time. Yet it takes phenomenally long from a customer perspective to get anything done. So we get a lot of delays, and then we get a lot of upset clients. And then you can imagine what happens when we have upset clients. You have meetings, lots and lots of meetings. And I say unnecessary meetings because they would be unnecessary if we were better at getting the value to customers faster, but they become necessary because the boss has now said, we need to meet about these upset clients. They're really annoyed about the delays, and we need to put together a plan of how we're going to address this, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I want to see reports and analytics, and we'll form committees and SWAT teams. Maybe we'll buy some new technology to track things or allow customers to track on the web where all of their work is. And so all sorts of ships get launched because of these this kind of perpetual busyness combined with delays. And you get, from the employee side of the equation, you get exhaustion, burnout, long hours, overtime, and so on. So I see this all the time in all sorts of office environments that I work in, and it's probably quite familiar to many of you as well. So resource efficiency seems like a good thing at first, right? Just, it's cost effective to produce billions of widgets per hour. But there's a lot of problems that happen when we keep our people really, really busy. So the punchline to this is that resource efficiency actually creates more work for us to do. And I should qualify that and say that too much resource efficiency creates more work for us to do in terms of additional meetings, additional tracking, additional things, which lean people like to call waste, right? It creates waste. So by being what we call quote unquote efficient, we're creating waste. And so this can't really be what lean's all about, because lean's supposed to be about removing waste. And yet people are saying, no, but it's about efficiency. So the other model that these two Swedish people come up with is a very different model, which they call flow efficiency, which really has to do much more with time and the time that it takes to deliver value to a customer. You might have noticed that in my little diagram with the factory, there was no customer involved there. And this might have been great in an era when price was the main driving factor, and there weren't a lot of goods to buy, and people wanted to buy whatever could be made at a cheap price. But we live in very competitive markets now, and whenever there's a competitive market, the time to value is a really important component. So we have to take into consideration customers, or our competitors will. So customers, this model is simple, and you'll recognize it. I think that customers make a simple request of your organization, your company, whatever it might be, and it applies to governments and nonprofits as well. And the central question, like I said, is that it's really, how long does it take the work to happen from the customer's perspective? How long does it take for the value to come out? And hopefully you get a smiling customer at the end if it doesn't take too much time. But it's really an outside-in perspective on what an organization is all about versus the inside-out focus, which traditional management often looks at, which is how busy are we keeping our machines and our people. And a flow-efficient view really takes a more systemic view of the work system. How does the work system then deliver that value to customers? And we're fond of saying at EDC that it's really a combination of people, and information and technology that interact to create the value for the customer. And this becomes the main goal of the company in a flow-efficient universe. And if there's one thing that's really exceptionally different about lean companies, it's that the main goal or purpose is really around the customer and satisfying customer needs and satisfying customer demand, rather than just to make money, right? So you go to business school, a lot of them will tell you that the purpose of a firm is to make profits, but really that's a kind of byproduct. And, in an old, maybe more industrial era, it made more sense. But right now in competitive markets, we have to please customers, and we will get profitability or some other kind of valuable result as a byproduct of that. So that's a real mindset shift that we see in lean organizations that we don't see in more traditionally managed ones. So to make this real to, or a bit more conceptually real to people in an office, I actually take a service-related example, but one that still has tangible outputs, because it's just simply easier to illustrate. So we all can relate to being at a restaurant. So let's say you go into a restaurant and you order a burger and fries and a drink. And there's a few other people in the restaurant, and they're ordering more or less the same thing. It's not a fancy restaurant, but it is, table service. They have table service. And after 10 minutes, you get your burger. That's great, but there's no drink. There's no fries. And you're saying, hey, wait a minute, waiter, where's the rest of my meal? But you can't get the waiter's attention because he's really, really busy. He's really, really resource efficient here because he's running around to every other table delivering burgers to all the tables. He thought he'd be efficient and just do the burgers all in a batch. And after, another 10 minutes, out come the fries, and you guessed it, he's running around delivering fries to every table. And same thing happens with the drinks. And what's important to note here is that after 30 minutes, all three tables receive their full meal. So it takes 30 minutes, and I'm just making up numbers here for the sake of illustration, but all three tables receive their quote-unquote value, which is the entire meal, at the same time. And it's not a good customer experience. I think you would agree. regardless of how tasty the food is, you really want your full meal all at once. So then I challenge people when I'm doing this in a live workshop, and I say, well, how would you improve this? Let's say you're the owner of the restaurant. How would you improve this? And the typical example, or the typical answer, I should say, that you get is, my guy is as busy as he can be. Look at him; he's running around from table to table. How can you ask me to do more? But in a simple example like a restaurant, people often, my batching is bad. Little warning there. But how can we improve the system? In this environment, you can see stuff, so you can see what's going on, and we have experience. And if anyone has ever worked in a restaurant, you'll know that there's a system in place. And I once worked in a restaurant, and I was really terrible at it. But many people when they're younger, at least, work in restaurants, and there's simply a system where you organize your orders by table and then by diner at each table, and you have a more or less a first in, first out system, right? It's not rocket science. So you bunch the orders together by the unit of value. If you know what the value is that the customers want, then you group it that way. So you would group orders by table and then deliver one meal, and then another meal, and then another meal. And by doing this, one table at a time, you're not only satisfying the customer, but you're probably saving a lot of time. Now, for the sake of example, I've made the time the same, because effectively, if everything else is equal, no one's working any harder or faster. Here we've got the waiter who's running around serving three meals to three tables. So the waiter isn't doing anything more or anything less. The kitchen is still producing the same amount of food. But what we can notice is that 2 out of the 3 tables are receiving their full meal faster than in the previous scenario. So, not only is table 3's meal, hot, but also it's no worse than in the first example, but the 2 out of 3 are significantly better. And to me, this seems like, on the one hand, it's very simple. On the other hand, it's the miracle of process design, where you can just rearrange the process, and without anyone working any harder or faster, you can satisfy better 2 out of 3 customers. And as it turns out, you get fewer complaints, and you have less to think about at once, and so on. So there's all sorts of side benefits that happen as well. And so I get people to look at this kind of simple model and say, well, how could you make your work operate in this one unit of value at a time? So they say, how do I make this happen, Ken? And I say, well, there's 2 principles you got to think about. One is continuity, which means just condensing the value stream, squishing things together that pertain to the same unit of value, the same meal. Deliver the burger and the fries and the drink all at the same time. So squish those together rather than making big batches of one thing or big batches of another. And the more you think about this, it applies to virtually like everything in your life. Even things, I work in the financing world, like I mentioned, and if you think about it, would you prefer to pay for your house or your car in one big lump sum, or would you like to break it out into smaller batches and have a kind of a steady flow of payments? Financing is the ultimate sort of flow machine to make things easier on customers. The other thing is balance, which is, as some leansters would say who are fond of Japanese terms, you might call it heijunka, or just level loading, or smoothing out the workflow. So those 2 things of condensing it in time and then balancing it out. Very simple to say, very hard to do, but at least it points us in the right direction of how we might start down the road to improving some of our process designs. So I'll get into continuity a little bit. what we see, and I think it should be clear to people who've been practicing lean for a while, but what I see in the office is that we have huge white spaces or waiting time in between elements of the same thing. So in a financing example, you would have underwriting, you would have risk analysis and mitigation strategies, and then you would have authorization and contract negotiation and so on. And these things might wait around for a long time as they move from different functional area to different functional area. And when you say this, people then say, well, I'm not just sitting around doing nothing. It's not like I do my work and then wait. What happens is that we insert unrelated work into these white spaces, and we end up multitasking and getting very, very busy. And this leads to kind of chaos and different priorities and the kind of, frenetic resource efficiency that we see in offices all the time. So the idea is to squish it together, and you'd want to choose your top priority item to squish together first, but you squish it together to not allow any of this unrelated work to really fall into the white spaces. And then you can deal with your second priority and third priority and so on after. So it's do one meal at a time and do it in a priority order. So that's the continuity example. And here I have, I work with a loans accounting team. Now, accounting is pretty complicated in a financial institution. And so I worked with this accounting group, and when I first met them, they didn't have any visual management whatsoever, but they all knew they all had their own little specialization. There were 6 people in the team, and they had their little specialized tasks that they had to do for month end. So so-and-so would do analysis X, and so-and-so would do analysis Y, and they would do various different things to manipulate data and come up with numbers and book entries and so on. They all knew what they had to do and what they were good at. They didn't know what each other was doing, and the manager of the group had no real concept of what needed to be done first, second, or third. So I got them involved in creating a kind of a Kanban board. And this isn't Kanban in the sense of a manufacturing replenishment system, but it's more in the Scrum sense of a Kanban board, where it's just a big whiteboard and sticky notes. And we had them organize the tasks by day. So they had 5 days, as you can see, and they'd put all their tasks that they needed to do in the ready column. And then they would, in sequential order of priority, start to address them on the right day. And once they'd finished it, they'd put it in the done column, and then they would go back and repeat the process until day 1 was done, and they'd move to day 2. And, it would move along like this until you get to day 5, and everything would look like that, where everything's in the right-hand column, everything's done. Now, of course, it didn't look like this at all. What it looked like was this, where, when they first started it, at least, they would find that, Casey would start doing some tasks and then finish those, but then she didn't really know how to do any of the day 1 tasks. So she would start in on working on something for day 3, even though it was still day 1. And maybe someone else would start working on a day 4 task because that was their area of specialization. And by visualizing it, it became very apparent that people were not doing this in the optimal sequence, but were rather doing it piecemeal here and there based on their own specializations. And they didn't have any view of how the work was flowing all together. And when there were dependencies, it meant there were delays, which just elongated the value stream. So what they did was they cross-trained people so they could do more tasks, and they had enough kind of bench strength to be able to do all of day 1 on day 1 and all of day 2 on day 2 and so on. So it was actually by making the problems visible that they were able to achieve more continuity in their work. And this is an actual picture of the real board that they were using, and it looks like they're kind of at the beginning of day 5 here. So it was a bit more complicated than the diagram I showed, but it was more or less looking like this. And they got phenomenal results. Before it took 5 days, it took 6 people 5 days. Afterwards, it took 3 people 5 days. Now, they could have reduced the timeline, but instead they decided to reduce people. But I want to be very clear that it wasn't like they got rid of 3 people. What happened was they were able to devote 3 staff to other projects 5 days of the month, which was immensely helpful because there's always big projects going on in accounting because there's a new accounting standard coming in, and that implies technology changes and so on. And they needed these subject matter experts to participate in these big projects. So suddenly they had additional capacity to devote to these projects, and month-end was still getting done on time with no heroic efforts. So that was a big win. Now, the other way that we can put this into practice is by considering balance, meaning to remove bottlenecks and to level out the workflow. And in a manufacturing sense, you might talk about this as adjusting the cycle times at each process step so that it would meet the takt time or be beneath the takt time, so that you'd have a kind of steady flow of output. So, you know, some jobs are big and some jobs are small. And so it takes a bit of creativity to smooth out the work, especially sometimes in knowledge work where the work is a bit emergent and you don't know how long it's going to take until you actually see what's behind the wall or under the hood or whatever metaphor you want to use. But the concept is this, it's just simply to make everything as equal as possible. Now, what we found has worked really well in an office environment is that we flow people to the work rather than changing the work itself and saying, oh, you just do half of this because you don't have time to do the whole thing. What we do is we put people onto the work. So we have a loans administration department, which we call loans services, and they're responsible for dispersing like billions of dollars nearly every day, as well as receiving the interest and the principal amounts and invoicing and taking care of a lot of different things to take care of all of our borrowers. And they're divided into 2 teams, diversified products and direct lending. It's not really important here why they're called that, but they are. So they huddle every day, a daily stand-up meeting, and they evaluate what they have to do that day. It's a very deadline-driven business. You know, people send in a notice and say, I want you to give me $100 million according to my loan contract by 1 p.m. today in this currency and so on, so at this bank account, and they have to pretty much do it. So they line up their deadlines, and so they see what's on their plate, and then they say, well, who's in the office and who have we got? And they evaluate what kind of workload each person has. So if you imagine these little bars here as people, staff, and you see some people are overloaded and some people are underloaded and have a bit of capacity to give. So they do a little bit of horse trading within their teams, and they smooth out the workload so that everybody is fully utilized but not overutilized, so that the work is really balanced. And this is an ideal scenario, but there are times where, despite their best efforts at switching things around and prioritizing within the teams, there might be one team that has more to do that day without fail than they can handle within their normal 7.5-hour day. So this is the amazing thing, is that the managers of the 2 teams actually have the humility and ability to talk to one another, which, and I say amazing in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, because in a lot of institutions, leaders kind of compete against each other. They're both vying for the next promotion, right? And so they want to look good. They want their team to look good. They don't necessarily want to help out another team to make someone else look good. But in EDC, we've evolved our culture to a point where people feel okay to ask for help, and for the managers to talk and to have a kind of common purpose of customer satisfaction rather than just individual resource efficiency measures, like how many widgets they're cranking out in their own team. So they talk. if one team's overloaded and they start to question priorities and say, maybe we can move something around. And they say, okay, let's do this one later. It's not as urgent as what you've got. We'll take your thing. I did all my own animation, by the way. I know it's a work of art. And this results in balancing between the teams. So it's not only within the team, but also between the teams, which I think is a really amazing thing that they do. And they're exceptionally successful at this. I don't think I have a slide on their success, but they've I used to have this stair-step kind of success story where I measured the amount of funds dispersed per employee, and it went from something like, $10 million a year to like $1 billion a year in the last 15 years or so per employee. So they had a lot of money. But I want to call attention to the fact that it works as a system. Is not just let's talk and share work, but they have to measure their work. They have to know, they have to estimate how long it's going to take. They've got to be able to freely communicate. They've got to be able to prioritize their work. And they've got that very well documented, and it's very standardized. They have to have alignment and common goals, and they have to have cross training so they can hand off work to each other and be able to effectively do each other's jobs. So these systems all work together in concert to create a balanced approach. So these are the two things that I talk about in the book and what I've been talking about today. Basically, on the one hand, you have resource efficiency, which is keeping your people and machines very busy for the purposes of lowering costs and driving profitability, where on the other hand, you have flow efficiency, which is delivery of value to the customer. So it's a customer first approach. And the idea is that if we satisfy customers, profitability will follow. Now, lean, at least according to these Swedish authors, is not one or the other, but it is actually trying to marry the two together. But they do point out that because we've lived with this sort of industrial model of efficiency for so long, this is well embedded as a practice. But flow efficiency is very deficient in most industries, in most cases. So in order to become a leaner company, it's not like we don't want to utilize our people, but we want to put more attention on flow efficiency so that we can have a more equitable balance between the two. And so the two principles that I posit, and this isn't, exceptionally original. If you're lean thinkers out there, you're quite familiar with this, I'm sure. But this notion of continuity, of squishing the value stream together so that you've got related tasks all being done one after the other, the sort of notion of single piece flow in a manufacturing sense. And then balance, which is to even out the workloads by either changing the work or changing the people or changing the time devoted to it. And so you get that sort of approach. And if you aim your process design at both continuity and balance, you will be in a much better place in terms of a lean operation. And people will be less overburdened and much happier. Now, usually when I do these presentations, people always say, well, give me something practical that I can do when I go back to the office. And they usually say, give me 3 things I can do. And I couldn't reduce it to 3, but I did reduce it to 6. So I'm going to give you 6 things. And I put Captain Obvious in the corner there because some of these things are perhaps obvious, yet we don't do them that often. So think about why that might be. Make your workflow visible, especially important in an office where we can't see the work. I would say that's the number one thing, is we need to visualize the work first so we can even begin to understand it. Secondly, measure efficiency from your customer's point of view, not from your own point of view of like, look how many things I worked on today, boss, but how much value did you deliver to a customer? Prioritize and schedule work. Seems like a no-brainer, but we often find in office workplaces that people are very laissez-faire. Oh, you're a smart person, you'll figure it out. Just go ahead and you do your best work and we'll deal with problems as they come up. And I often see this attitude on the part of managers in office environments. Limit work in process. This is gaining more and more popularity as an idea. This notion of not multitasking, I think it's largely because the agile software movement and related practices like Scrum and XP and what have you, DevOps and so on, all of them say you have to limit work in process. And this is a hugely beneficial thing to do when you want to become more productive and more valuable to your customers. Cross-train and share work. This is very important in an office where the work is hard to divide up, but the work can be shared, but only if we cross-train. And there's some constraints to this, like there are people who are professional accountants, say, and they can't become lawyers, nor can lawyers become accountants. But the lawyers often have their own little specializations and islands, and they can be cross-trained to do a variety of law-related work, and the accountants can do a variety of accounting work and so on. So, you know, people will say, well, we can't do this because we're professionals. Well, it turns out you can if you try. And lastly, make problems to workflow your friends. And this I'm borrowing from the former Toyota employees and now consultants in their own right, Tracy and Ernie Richardson. They always say, make problems your friends. And you really do need to make problems your friends. I tell people that lean tools are not about solving problems. They're actually about making problems visible so we can solve them. So you want problems. No problem is a problem. And so that's my talk today. I have to put in a little plug for the book that this talk has been based on in part. It's called Office Lean, as you can see, and it's available at CRC Press. It's also available at other familiar booksellers, like the one you see on your screen. I can, if you're interested, I think I have a discount code where you can get 30% off the CRC Press one. So get in touch if you'd like, if you're interested in purchasing the book. And so that concludes my talking. Thank you for listening. I'd love to open it up to Q&A now, and so I don't have to do all the talking.
Great, Ken. I have unmuted the phones. If anyone has any questions, please chime in, and also use the chat function if that's easier for you. I'm going to pause and we'll be silent and see what questions people might have or comments. It's always helpful to pause a little bit and see how the silence works for people. We have a courteous group, and Ken, I've got a question. As you are thinking about this with a group of people that you want to try to unpack this with, is there sort of a rule of thumb approach that you use as you're, say, working with folks that you want to try to make this concept of lean more real for them in the office world? Is there like heuristics or rules of thumb that you use that said, first I try to do this, then I try to do that?
Yes and no. Like it's very heuristic, as you mentioned. I'll often I like to, the first thing I like to do is go see. Mm-hmm. Is, you know, I like to embed myself with the people doing the work, sit alongside them, observe them, ask a lot of questions before I do anything, and then you know, I make notes and so on, but I don't usually say anything. And then I ask the team. I say, you know, like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And this is a familiar refrain from lean people, but what are you trying to accomplish here? And then I marry that with what I saw, and depending on where people are at in terms of their sophistication with visual management, with frequent communication and stuff, I might make some suggestions, but I'll often try to do this kind of 1 hour little mini teach session to get their minds thinking about different ways to model the work. And then I'll say, well, what about this? I noticed, so-and-so was doing this. So it's very contextual, but I would say the guidelines I use are first of all, go see what's happening and really define the problem that they're trying to solve. And from there, it may go in a bunch of different directions, including value stream mapping or gathering more metrics or so on.
Okay, that's great. I'll pause again to see if there's any questions. I can always delete the pauses when we do the recording too. Another question I was thinking of, Ken, as we close this out, and it perhaps is related to your first response. Is there any different approach you use with the people that, say, are doing the work, or the frontline managers and the leaders of an organization, and the kind of advice that you're giving to them? In other words, does the same heuristics apply?
No, they don't. It's different. I would encourage leaders to go see, and so that, whereas the people on the front lines don't need to really go see, although sometimes I will get them to go to different functional areas to go see. But certainly with leadership, I encourage them to go to the front lines. I encourage leaders to try to adopt a mindset that their job is really to enable value creation, and that although it's a somewhat bitter pill to swallow for some leaders who are very proud, I say right out that the people on the front lines are the only ones who are really creating value for customers, and that leadership is really only about enabling that. It's very important. And work can't happen without them, but they don't directly add value. So if they come to accept that, then they start to reorient themselves and kind of look at the work differently and see their job a little differently.
Okay.
To just add to your question, like for the frontline associates, I really make a deliberate approach of always considering what's in it for them. So I always approach it with, this is going to make your life easier. Let's see how we can make your job easier. I feel pretty strongly about this. Any other approach will not work. If you go in there and say, we're doing this to save money, we're doing this to benefit the company, and not you, you wouldn't say it as bluntly as that, but if it comes across that way, it's never going to work. So it has to, start from a position of like, how do we make your work easier? And then you branch out from there about what are you doing for customers and so on.
Okay. There is a question that's on the chat function. Actually, it comes in two parts. The first question was, so what does value mean in lean?
I guess I'm going to give a simple answer to that, and that it's whatever the customer wants. It's usually, in a commercial sense, people say it's what the customer is willing to pay for, but there can be other scenarios where the customer doesn't pay directly. Up here in Canada, for instance, patients of our healthcare system do not pay directly for healthcare, for instance, or most government services are delivered. We're all paying for it through taxes and so on. But so citizens can receive value from a government agency that doesn't really fit the definition of what they're willing to pay for, but they have to receive something that is valuable to them. So the important thing to think about is customer. the customer is the only entity or stakeholder that can decide what value really means.
Mm-hmm.
And usually companies have multiple customers, so you might have multiple segments, and people in the marketing department will tell you all about that, about, well, we got small customers, we got big customers, and so on. So they may value different things, and that's fine. But as long as it's customer-centered definition of value, then that you're not going to go too far wrong.
Okay. And then there's a follow-up question. I think it was prompted by the discussion about different approaches for leaders in an organization. And the question goes like this. So is leadership, quote, waste in a lean sense?
In a way it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I mean, most lean people will talk about, non-value adding work that can be removed, and sort of business non-value adding work, or
Mm-hmm.
type 2 and type 1 wastes and so on, where there's some waste that you can remove now and some waste that you can remove given the current conditions. I think in a perfect world, we'd all be self-organizing and that, like frontline people would just seamlessly deliver value to customers.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard for me to imagine an orchestra without a conductor kind of thing. So it's hard for me to imagine a leaderless world. But yeah, I'd say they're kind of necessary, non-value adding
Mm-hmm.
is what I would say about leaders.
I
wouldn't necessarily say that to their face.
Yeah, I think that's an honest response, and I appreciate that. I'm going to pause one more time, see if anyone has any questions.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Oh, hi. Yeah, this was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. I was curious what types of measures you find most useful for this type of work in administration, and in particular, our group, we're internal service providers, so providing, we provide the HR, the IT, all those types of functions that support all the business units. So we always struggle with measurement in administration. And so I was just curious what you have found to be useful.
Yeah, great question. I work with administration a lot too. I work with the accounting groups. I work with technology. Haven't worked much with HR, but I work with, like loans administration and so on. So I've worked most of my career at EDC with kind of secondary support groups. But time, like when it comes to measures, most companies are really good at measuring money after the fact, because they're obliged to, and they often can count things like, oh, we handled so many requests, or we handled so many emails, or whatever it is. But very, very few people actually measure time in a meaningful way. Like, how long does it take to actually go from start to finish from the customer's point of view? And this can be an internal customer too. So the important metrics are really time. A secondary consideration is just employee satisfaction, which is very nebulous and hard to measure. But I always say, look, if we're going to, measure time and then improve the time it takes to serve our internal customers, we also have to make sure we're not doing this at the expense of employee engagement and satisfaction. So those are my two go-tos. Now, I'm being a bit generic because I don't know the specific situation, but on a generic abstract level, that's what I would recommend, is think about time, think about employee engagement.
Great, thank you.
Great, appreciate that, Ken. So what I'm going to do is thank Ken for his time, and if anyone wants to take Ken up on that offer for the discount for the book, we can include any contact information directly to Ken, so I don't have to be the go-between, but we can work that out. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what happens next from our standpoint. This recording, if you go to our website, and you can see where we store the upcoming webinars, this is going to be moved to the previous webinars, and people can access the recording that way. Anyone that participated is going to get a link to today's recording, and you can use it and then share it with others. Coming up next month, friend and colleague Kevin McNamara has done a previous webinar for us on the topic of leader standard work, and you can get the bit.ly link to his presentation from 2018 down below there. But on February the 21st, Kevin's going to give a follow-up on his personal experiments with leader standard work. He calls it personal management system. I think that's probably a term that I had something to do with introducing to him, and it resonates with him. So he's going to be talking about his latest experiments in leader standard work. In April, Jason Schulist, who works out of Appleton, Wisconsin, is going to talk about generativity using adaptive problem solving on thorny community problems. And I presented at a couple of his annual presentations on what he calls Skills Fest. And it's really interesting work on very difficult issues that communities are trying to deal with, and how he's trying to help organizations with that. So that's going to be in April. There's a number of topics that we've got in the works that we're working on, and if anyone does have any topics that they would like to present on, or topics they would like to learn about, just forward information to me by email, and we'll get it scheduled. So again, I want to thank our presenter today, Ken. I really appreciate you taking the time to put it together, and thank people for taking the time to participate today. And hope everyone has a good day, and there's a weekend coming up, so have a good weekend as well. Thanks again for participating.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all to the participants.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.